There we go. All right. Let's pull this back up. We're going to look at 1 Kings 7, chapter 17 and 19 today. Test 1, 2. Test, test. Baffle. There we go. Test. That should be better. There we go. Perfect. Okay. We are ready to rock and roll. And that's a great question. So far, I don't see anybody else signing on. But my hunch is they'll join us in a little bit. Sometimes it takes a while for Zoom to boot up for people. And she split off and did her own thing. So there are, I go back to help think about and frame your question. There's a old German theologian, Niebuhr. Now I get confused because there were two brothers, Reinhold and I forget what his might be Richard. But Reinhold Niebuhr wrote about Christ and culture. And there are many different avenues that you can have Christ against culture, Christ with culture, Christ in culture. There are so many different ways of looking at how does the church, and specifically Jesus, approach cultural traditions, and how does he deal with it. And the truth is, depending on how you interpret interactions that Jesus has, there are, as Niebuhr says, there are many different biblically acceptable answers to what that looks like. And so many churches take the stance Christ against culture. My particular way I look at it is Christ is in culture. But there are ones that Christ transforms culture, and sometimes the ELCA leans into the Christ transforms culture, or depending then how you look at it in a cyclical nature, that culture transforms how Jesus is viewed. But I can present that at another time if you're interested.
Yeah.
And then talk about the varying responses that churches have with the interpretation of where Jesus and the world meet up. All right.
This one, I tagged her on YouTube in one of hers, and I listened to a few minutes, and I said, this, I don't even need to listen to this one.
No.
This was like her views on sex, and she was as much saying anything goes, it's okay.
Yes. So she.
Got more tattoos than sailors.
Yes. And so she reaches a group of people with a gospel that I like to say I would not. That's.
I think personally she's in for a wide awakening one day.
But I also understand that we've experienced it here at the church when she spoke at National Youth Gathering. She has.
That, Felix was telling me about.
Yeah, so she has, from my estimation, using Luther's Eighth Commandment, she has a very good way of explaining sinner-saint understanding that's very Lutheran in its core. Views on human sexuality, and I would say she errs more on she's gospel only instead of law and gospel. This is the nicest way I'll put that. That was with Nadia Bolz-Weber. So, but today we're going to look at 1 Kings chapters 17 and 19. So where is it that we encounter angels? The first was in the book of Genesis with Jacob wrestling with the angel of God, or God, and the idea of a message being delivered there. Angels at their core are ones who deliver messages, and in fact today when we look at 1 Kings 17 and 19, and the reason we're going to start in 17, it's important to have a backstory of who Elijah is, so that we can understand better the encounter he has with the angel, the messenger of God, in chapter 19. And then last week we talked about Gideon and how sometimes even when an angel shows up, we like to really test to make sure that it is indeed God who's doing the work. Trust but verify. So in 1 Kings 17, in the first few verses, there's a lot of information. Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word." And the word of the Lord came to him, "Depart from here, and turn eastward, and hide yourself in the brook Cherith, that is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook I have commanded. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. So Elijah went and did according to the word of the Lord, and he went and dwelt by the brook Cherith, that is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. After a while the brook dried up, because there was no rain in the land. And there are a few very fascinating things here. Gilead, I have a little map here and sent out the map this morning in the Bible study notes. For those on Facebook, if you'd like to email our church, emmanuel@shentel.net, and get copies of the notes from today and the map, if you can email the church, we'll send them out to you. But Elijah, so I was thinking about this as I printed out the map and shared with you all today. We tend to think of Paul's missionary journeys and all the places that Paul went as pretty impressive. But as I was looking through Elijah's journey, here is Samaria. And then that is a region as well as a city. And so Samaria, the region, is here. And then the city of Samaria is just to the north of where the name is there. And that's where Elijah approaches the throne of King Ahab. Now, if Samaria sounds vaguely familiar, there are a group of people that are famous, especially in the New Testament, the Samaritans. Samaritans are not always seen culturally and religiously as exemplary models of faith, but Jesus lifts them up that way in a parable. The parable of does anybody know? The Good Samaritan. And the idea of Jesus using that word and that parable is, for many faithful Jewish people, there was no such thing as a Good Samaritan. And the interesting part of what you're going to find here is there's a backstory there. King Ahab was one of the evil kings that was reigning, and he has one of his many famous wives is Jezebel. And so you might have heard no one wants to be a Jezebel. So you'll understand, because Jezebel is one of the women who wants Elijah dead. So, but in this particular story of what we encounter, so Tishbe is I'm going to say roughly 30 miles due east of Samaria, the capital. So Elijah has come, he's from Tishbe to the east, and that is below the Sea of Galilee and to the east side of the Jordan River. And as he's taking off there, he travels from Tishbe to Samaria in order to address the king. Now, most of the time, you had to have a reason to approach the king. Either somebody had to vouch for you, or you don't just walk up to a king. Kind of like you don't just walk up to a president nowadays. You have to have somebody who's going to vouch to get you there that has clout and authority. Well, one of the fascinating parts that takes place here of who does Elijah think he is. So who does Elijah think he is? Because when he shows up to talk and present before the king Ahab there in verse 17, he stands before him and he treats him with the respect of a king. But the other challenging part was that while he does treat him with respect, he says the reason he's standing before him is because of Yahweh. And so when he's saying he stands before him because of Yahweh, he's in a entirely different framework, because he's not saying I have authority to be here because like the equivalent of a prime minister or a military officer has helped present me. I'm here because God told me to be, and I'm standing in as God's second. So the other part of that wording, Felix and Pam, were in 1 Kings 17, verses 1 through 5. 1 Kings 17, 1 through 5, is that while he's claiming the authority from God, God is claiming Elijah as his second. So when he's standing before him, he's basically representing Yahweh and claiming Yahweh's divine authority as his ambassador. He's the one who's the intercessor, the one who acts on behalf of Yahweh. So not only does a prophet deliver a message, but Elijah's status before the king is one in which he's portraying himself as Yahweh's lieutenant, God the Father's first in command. The other thing that happens there in 17 is here's this one who's acting on behalf of Yahweh and has this major clout to stand before the king, and he's going to flee back east to the Cherith area. And what does it say? That while he's mighty in word, he is very frail and human, because he needs what? You're going to... Yep, drink and food. Very much human, and the basic needs that Elijah has are ones like all of us. Have you ever been tired because you're hungry? I mean, Snickers knows that's true. I always laugh at the Snickers commercials. You're not you when you're hungry. Yep, Betty White. And Danny DeVito's the other one. Yeah. So there he is. Now the interesting thing of where angels start to come into play here, angels are messengers of God. And specifically in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, that's one of the things. They deliver messages, or ones who act on behalf. How many of you have the word ravens there? That ravens are the ones who are the messengers, the ones delivering food.
What verse would that be?
I believe it's verse 3 and 6. 3 and 6.
King James says ravens to feed thee.
So one of the interesting things about that Hebrew word that's used is it not only refers to an animal, the raven, but it also referred to a group of Bedouin Arabs. And that was an interesting side note that I learned. So sometimes we think, well, that's pretty strange that ravens would bring Elijah food. Now, this is where the parallel comes, no matter ravens, birds, or Bedouin Arabs. Bedouin Arabs and ravens were similar in that both were considered scavengers and scroungers. So ravens as birds are not ones that I would call, they're not majestic. Quite frankly, sometimes we have ravens that every morning decide they're going to take from our neighbor's pear tree, fly up on top of our roof, and drop them either off onto our back deck half-eaten, or litter our front yard and our eaves and our gutters. I don't like ravens very much. And the truth is, in that day and time, my feeling would be similar to the sentiment of how faithful Hebrews and Jews would have heard that word. Why are the ravens, the scavengers, the scroungers, the not so savory birds, by the way, and that term also fit the Bedouin Arabs that were also a part of that, the place that Elijah ends up there in that area of Gilead, somewhere near the Cherith. So they don't know exactly where that brook is to this day, but they believe that there's a Cherith ravine. So in the map that was sent out, where they believe Tishbe in the Cherith ravine to be is off the Jordan River, north and east of Samaria, and before you get to Tishbe. So on that map that's sent out, roughly here, and the best part is on the map it'll say this is where Elijah was fed by ravens. And so he's near his home place, but he didn't get all the way back there. And in fact, he's probably hiding out in cliffs and crags and caves for his own protection. So he went and challenged the king and said, you know what? You're not getting any water in this land. My God's going to make sure of it until you listen to me and do what I say. And the king's like, who are you to call me out this way? And the voice of God tells him, Elijah, I think you've offended him. Get out now while you can still have your life. So he flees, gets out of Dodge, and ends up in the Cherith ravine. And while he's up there, he's fed by ravens. So whether he was fed by literal birds or a Bedouin people, the point is he was at the mercy of outsiders to his own culture, and ones that are scavengers, not necessarily suppliers or providers. Yes, go ahead, Felix.
The Jordan River, that sounds like Moses, but he was told he would not cross the Jordan. Elijah could cross it if he wished, I guess.
Well, he could cross it because God told him to. And in that time there was a severe drought, so that the water table would not have been as high. I mean, I thought about it this summer when looked at the Shenandoah for a vast number of days in July and all before that major rainstorm. I could walk across most of the places that were very deep, and the places that were even that would have been up to my neck or above were to my waist or below. And so that changes the scope of things. And so here you have the idea of who is this Elijah, and all we know is that he is from this land, Tishbe. Oh, the Hebrew word, in case you care about it, is Cribim, Crybym, which one way means ravens and pronounced another way means Arabs, the Bedouin Arabs. So that's why I thought that was an interesting word choice. Pam, that's a very good note there, that the Cultural Background Bible mentions that ravens would store excess food in rocky crags And that could be what Elijah was eating. And that he would head to a brook that was there, that had not dried up to that point, to drink the water he needed. Then as soon as he runs out of a water source there, he ends up having to go. And so here's the irony of how God works. So I'm going to get to the angel concept here, but it's also, angels have human forms at times. And this is a map I'm going to share for Sunday as well in worship, because you're going to see here, this is Phoenicia and Syrian Phoenicia is up in this area. And between Tyre and Sidon is a village called Zarephath. And the widow at Zarephath, who is called upon to feed Elijah, is an interesting thing. Widows are ones who are what? Who are biblically called the ones we should provide for.
But she's providing too.
Yes. And so what you have here is this complete role reversal of what's taking place for Elijah. Here he is delivering the word of God and cared for by ravens that are normally the ones that are scavengers, not suppliers. And then the widow here, who's one that is supposed to be provided for, not the one actively doing the providing. And so what's taking place of why Elijah gets recognized as one of the most significant prophet within the biblical landscape is because he has the audacity to stand up to an entire regime solely by himself and manages to overthrow it. But his trust and his dependence comes from a bunch of outsiders that change the scope of how God is viewed. The inclination is who would provide for Elijah, the prophets. The wealthy that have the resources to do so, or in this case, or animals that's their normal tendencies, their care and their nurture. No, it's God is found in the opposite. And if you don't believe me, if God's found in the opposite as the major theme in the prophet Elijah, where does Elijah expect God to be? Does anybody know that story? Fire, smoke, thunder. That's all these big, loud, natural functions. And instead, God is found in the silence. In the opposite, in the absence of where we would believe God to be. For reference on that one, let me figure out.
At that time, people believed God to be in specific places, whereas now we believe him to be everywhere.
Correct.
Did they also believe that?
Yes. So that is in 1 Kings 19:11-21. God said, "Go forth, stand on the Mount Oreb, and behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and broke it in pieces, and the rocks before the Lord but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire a still small voice. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him, "What are you doing, Elijah?" And Elijah says, "I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down thy altars, slain the prophets with the sword. And I, even I, only am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And God said to him, "Go, return your way, the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, you're going to anoint a new king." That always goes well, right? When you get back, here's your job. Go anoint a new king. Well, that doesn't work. So, in all of that, you find these struggles of how things work that way. Whoops, there we go. But in 1 Kings 19, in the first part of it, when Elijah's at Mount Oreb,
Pastor,
yes.
I said you froze up.
Oh, whoops. Here. Let's see. Uh-oh. Am I still frozen?
No, you're good.
Okay. There we go. In 1 Kings 19:4, but Elijah himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough now, O Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." And he lay down and slept under a broom tree, and behold, an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank. Then he went back to rest. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, else the journey will be too great for you." And he arose and ate and drank, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Oreb, the mount of God. Pretty interesting. What's the number? Uh-oh. Let's do this. Uh-oh, I'm frozen again, aren't I?
Yep.
I thought that would help. I took it off the internet. Well, so much for that. I don't know why it's being funny. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. But the angel showing up in two places, in the tree, under a broom tree again. Here, where is it that the people of God seek refuge? And it's under a tree. And it's never lost on me. Does anybody know the stories around how gravity was discovered?
Wasn't it the apple?
Yeah, Newton's apple. Newton's apple. And so I always think about the greatest discoveries of divine revelation happen under trees. And for Elijah, it was no different. Under the broom tree, he's seeking refuge and the divine connection. And what happens is the angel of the Lord then shows up, provides food and nourishment and encouragement. So the most important thing, if you ever feel like I don't know what to do, nourishment and encouragement are the two basic faith-filled virtues. Nourishment and encouragement. And by doing those two simple things, we end up being messengers of God's grace and provision to people, and most importantly, live out our faith. So nourishment and encouragement are two principles that I think are essential in understanding our faith-filled practices and faithful.
And that's what you have at funerals.
Yep. Nourishment and encouragement. When all else fails, and you think about over the course of the summer when we had the 5 weeks of I am the bread of life passages, it's all from nourishment and encouragement. Trying to get people to understand the connectivity of being connected to God that way, through nourishment and encouragement. And so once you have those things in place, then you move on, and Elijah does. And I always look at one of the things I decided to do one year during Lent was I called it famous 40s. and the amount of times you see in biblical numbers why 40 is so important. 40, the amount of days it rained, and the flood of Noah is 40. And 40 serves as a biblical number of preparation and penitence. So if you think about why did the Israelites wander for 40 years, that's excessive. But it was to prepare in a time of penitence so that when they do finally enter into the promised land, there aren't people bitter and resentful. A whole generation that only thought of the good things of slavery is gone. God didn't want nostalgia to disrupt what God was doing. And if you think about it, the people who grumble the most in the wilderness all have a common theme. We ate blah, blah, blah. I remember the days when ... And a helpful perspective of why the Israelites wandered for 40 years in seminary was the idea of God creating new covenants with new people. It's one of the other reasons why Moses. So everybody points to the fact that Moses did something wrong, and that's why he couldn't enter into the promised land. And that's true, but I also think the idea of people who traveled and learned from their parents and the generation, by the time that Joshua, son of Nun, and others that were lieutenants or younger as they're coming through, they have the vision of expectation instead of the remembrances of things that were. If that makes sense. It also could be that they didn't have compasses and they wandered around in circles. But
They didn't have GPS.
no, they did not have GPS. So in this part of the story of why Elijah ends up able to complete the journey is the idea of God's provision, and that Pam says GPS can also lead you in circles. Don't I know it? Especially around Rock Creek Parkway in D.C., Felix. I was thinking about that. I was trying to get...
Lost there?
Pardon me?
You have been lost?
Yeah, so when I was trying to get on Rock Creek Parkway and look at where I missed one turn and it ended up taking me in circles. So...
This does not work out at the truck stops either.
Oh, nope. It'll get you turned around there too.
There are all kinds of bread in their tractor trailers, and they can't deliver them.
Nope. So you can have those.
All my days of sailing, I never owned a GPS.
There you go.
So dead reckoning.
After your mention of the circle, when I was working up in New Jersey, right across from Philadelphia, just below Camden, there's a particular circle, and I get a call from work one morning, and it's Jackie. I'm lost. Well, where are you? I'm on a circle and I can't get off of it. And I knew exactly where she was, and then I had to think and come up with a landmark. And I told her a particular landmark. I said, go around the circle, and when you see this landmark on your right, take the next exit. Take the next exit out of it, and you'll be heading straight back to the house, or to the apartment. But she went around that circle 3 or 4 times before I found her.
Mm-hmm.
Where are you? And she tried, I don't know. I said, how am I supposed to help you? I don't know.
And usually when we get lost, we look for a landmark or a name, something to help guide us. And then, so I always like, Felix, you'll appreciate this. The original GPS is God's positioning star. Everybody used to look up and guide by, in fact, sailing, most people still do, nautically.
Yeah, that's very important.
Finding the North Star. So,
It helps if you have a sextant to measure arcs and degrees.
so you've got those things. Now, the other part of this map for Elijah, it's pretty amazing to me. He ends up all the way south. So his time takes him all the way north to the top of the map and Tyre, Sidon, and Syrophoenicia, and then all the way almost to the bottom of the map here, Beersheba, in a desert because he's trying to hide from Jezebel. And he ends up all over the place. He was not able to stay still for very long. Probably because he didn't want to be caught, and then also because he knew there were very few places he could be that were safe. He was the last one standing, and so what he means by that is all the other prophets who tried to speak against King Ahab were taken out. They were removed. And God's given him this command, and he's like, so if you ever hear the idea of a reluctant prophet, because prophets don't end up having great success in terms of delivering messages and living. Nobody wants to hear what a prophet has to say, especially people in power. And Elijah spends most of his time on the run. But in terms of the angelic message that I take away is there's a couple. One, it's an interesting thing that God works in the opposite, or sometimes through unexpected people. The unexpected people being the widow from Zarephath who provides, the ravens, the unexpected animal, the unexpected bird, or whether it was a Bedouin, the unexpected people. Those were not Bedouins. Arabs weren't the ones who recognized Elijah and his people and said, hey, those are good people, we'll take care of you. Bedouins were nomads who took care of themselves and were scavengers. Yes?
Have you ever thought of the similarity between the story of the widow and the feeding of the 5,000?
Yep. And oftentimes, what was written in the commentary was the idea of what's provided by the ones who don't have enough usually is the thing that feeds so many and the thing that lasts.
Well, I wonder what he ate that took him for 40 days and 40 nights. He must have had a big steak dinner or something.
Well, it's... Yeah. I was going to look here. What did it say? Cakes of bread and water, I thought. A special kind of cake of bread. So cake is what I have. Felix, do you have in the King James, is that a cake?
Oh, yeah.
What do you all have in that word? I believe it's... Is it 6, verse 6?
Now also in verse 6, 17:6, and the ravens brought him bread and flesh in the morning, and bread and flesh in the evening.
Now, what does that sound like? So with the 40, what does that also sound like? The provision of food in the wilderness is equivalent to the Israelite journey in Exodus. There's a reason why Pam says bread and meat, maybe he ate a raven. Could have, I suppose. But the idea being that in the story of Scripture, birds and bread as feeding things to sustain people for the journey. So manna, and in this case, cakes. And then quail, and if Pam's right, then Elijah was eating ravens, birds. Mm-hmm. Oh, and in case you were wondering, Elijah's journey took him north to modern-day Lebanon. So Tyre and Sidon are in Lebanon, modern-day Lebanon, and then all the way down to southern Israel.
And that's where the fighting is today, between Hezbollah
Mm-hmm.
and the Israelites.
Yep. The other reason that's interesting, every time Elijah leaves a place, its area in that time received famine and drought, or drought and famine, probably in that order. Drought, then famine. And go for it, Felix.
Where did Elisha come from?
Mm-hmm.
When did he meet up with Elijah? It was like Elijah was a father image to Elisha, but I don't think he was his actual father.
Mm-mm.
No. Elisha was the son of Shaphat, chapter 19, verse 19. So he departed from there and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen in front of him. And he was with the 12. Elijah passed by him and cast his cloak upon him.
Ah,
Yoke of oxen, that's a pretty good team.
Mm-hmm. That's,
Isn't it two?
it's usually two. So what you're hearing is that this is a substantial field that he's plowing. So as Elisha is a man whose family has means. Darn, this one doesn't have anything. I thought for sure they'd put a good reference of why Elisha is there. Oh,
he arose and went after Elijah and ministered unto him. Last verse. Elisha had a father and mother.
Yeah.
the anointing of Elisha.
Let me, I pray thee, kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow thee.
Why did he slaughter the oxen?
To get food, he boiled them.
Here it says, and in fact, Luke 9:57 to 62 makes a clear allusion to this passage and demands of Jesus' followers a more immediate and radical break with the past than is accepted in the case of Elijah. So, and Elisha, remember that they say, let me go say goodbye, and Jesus says, that was good enough for Elisha, but that's not good enough for me. You're going now.
And from then on, he treated Elijah as his father,
Mm-hmm.
as his leader. Because that's the way they died.
Sure, and that would be similar to the way in which, in the calling of the disciples, but the great terminology there that I love is the passing on of the mantle. So he calls 3 people there to follow, but only one, Elisha, is the one that receives the mantle of leadership. So the idea within the pastoral ministry, the yoking of stoles, the placing on of the burden of the responsibility of leadership, and the wearing of said mantle. That's why one of the 2 descriptions of what a stole is it's the placing on of the mantle. The mantle is one that means one who carries authority. Such that when Elijah is gone, Elisha is the one who speaks with the same authority, that same mantle. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And the idea of passing by is one that ties in. How was King David chosen? God passed by, God passed by, God passed by. Whoop. God picks.
I don't understand. Right before 21, it said, "Go back." Elijah replied, "What have I done to you?" I don't understand that. It's part of 20. So it's like Elijah didn't want him.
Yeah, I'm like you, man. I'm not clear on 20 through the end. 20 through 21. Or 22, yeah.
I'm trying to see if I can find anything here. The first part, in verse 15, when it says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" is on the basis of they were afraid something bad was going to happen to the people. Or it's not the hero welcome that we would expect. So it says here, Elijah puts the whole onus on Elisha. The young man rightly understands the receipt of Elijah's mantle as a summons, yet the master parries his request for immediate compassionate leave with the suggestion that he has made no claim on him. And in fact, Luke does that. I don't know. I'll have to look up some more on that in the transition for next week. But next week's lesson, we will look at the divine favor with women. We're going to look at the angel who shows up to visit Elizabeth and the angel who shows up to visit Mary. And we can go from there. Well, may the Lord bless us and keep us. May the Lord make his face to shine upon us, be gracious unto us. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon us and give us peace. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Pastor.
You're welcome. Hope you get to feeling better soon, Peggy.
I feel fine. I just don't sound good.
Okay. Well, that's good. That